3 children and 2 dogs entered a tunnel in the rocks, and what they discovered changed everything. Emily Grace held tightly to her younger siblings' hands as their Grandma Margaret's shouts echoed through the stone house. Nathan, just 8 years old, trembled beside her, and little Lily Rose, 6 years old, hadn't stopped crying since the adults began arguing in the kitchen. It was when Butterscotch and Popcorn, the 2 mutts who lived in the yard, began barking desperately toward the large rock formations at the back of the property. The dogs were sniffing something in the air and running in circles, clearly agitated by something the children couldn't perceive. "Let's go see what it is," whispered Nathan, always curious about everything that happened on that farm lost in the heart of Appalachia. "Grandma said not to go far from the house," Emily Grace reminded him, but her voice carried more worry about the shouts coming from the kitchen than with her grandmother's warning. Lily Rose tugged at the simple dress her mother had sewn the week before and pointed to the dogs, who were now disappearing between the gigantic rocks that formed a kind of natural maze on the family's land. "They're gone," said the girl, her voice choked. Emily Grace looked back, seeing the closed kitchen door from which raised voices still came. Her father had returned from a trip that morning with bad news about the family's financial situation, and ever since the adults had been arguing about what to do with the farm that had been in the family for 3 generations. "We'll just take a quick look," decided the 11-year-old girl, who always felt responsible for looking after her younger siblings when their parents were busy. The 3 walked across the packed dirt yard, passing the wooden fence that bordered the tangerine orchard where they used to play. The late afternoon sun painted the rocks with golden hues, creating deep shadows between the crevices and formations that had always sparked the children's curiosity. "Butterscotch, Popcorn," called Nathan, but the dog's bark seemed to come from far away, muffled by the stones. Lily Rose tripped on a root and Emily Grace helped her up, brushing the dirt from her scraped knee. It was then that she noticed the barking was coming from an opening between 2 enormous rocks she had never noticed before, hidden behind a wild-growing evergreen bush. "They went in there," said Nathan, pointing to the narrow crack that seemed to lead inside the rock formation. Emily Grace hesitated. The opening was dark, and she couldn't see where it ended. The dog's barks echoed from within, mixed with strange sounds she couldn't identify. There was something different in the air, a smell of mold and old things that made her feel a chill in her stomach. "Grandma always said not to mess with the rocks," Lily Rose remembered, but her childish curiosity was greater than her fear. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The wind coming from inside the tunnel brought a louder bark from Butterscotch, followed by a worried whimper. It was the sound he made when he was scared, and that was enough for Emily Grace to make a decision. "They might be in danger," she said, already crouching to enter the opening. "Nathan, you stay here outside with Lily Rose." "No," protested the boy. "We go together. We always do everything together." Emily Grace knew it was no use arguing. Since they were little, the 3 siblings had made a pact to never separate, especially after their parents started traveling more for work and they spent long periods only with their Grandma Margaret. The girl entered the crack first, which was wider than it seemed from the outside. Her hands touched the cold, damp stone walls as she moved slowly forward, followed by her siblings. The passage widened as they went deeper, and soon they could walk upright. "It's really dark," murmured Lily Rose, grabbing her brother's hand. "The dogs are up ahead," said Nathan, pointing to where a faint light seemed to come from somewhere further on. The tunnel curved gently to the right, and as they rounded the bend they saw it opened into a much larger natural cavity. Small beams of sunlight entered through cracks in the ceiling, creating a mysterious golden illumination that revealed something that left the 3 of them frozen. Butterscotch and Popcorn stood still in the center of the space, sniffing objects scattered across the packed dirt floor. There were old clothes, dented pots, some empty cans, and, most strikingly, a collection of photographs spread out as if someone had dropped them there. "Someone lived here," whispered Emily Grace, feeling her heart race. Nathan approached a pile of objects and picked up a broken pair of glasses with a gold frame. Beside it was a brown leather wallet, so old and faded it seemed to have been left there a long time ago. "Look at this," he said, showing the wallet to his sisters. "There's a name here, Lily Rose stepped closer, curious, while Emily Grace examined the photographs. They were old black and white photos showing people in clothing from decades past. One caught her attention. It was a picture of Grandma Margaret, but very young, maybe 20, next to a man she didn't recognize. Charles William Harrison, read Nathan, deciphering the faded letters on the wallet. This name, isn't it the same last name as Grandma's? Emily Grace took the wallet from her brother's hands and examined the identification card still inside, protected by a yellowed plastic sleeve. The photo showed a young man with features vaguely reminiscent of Grandma Margaret's, but there was something in his eyes that conveyed a deep sadness. Date of birth. He would be Grandma's uncle, or something like that, calculated Emily Grace, always good with numbers. Butterscotch whined softly and headed to another corner of the cave, where there were more objects. An old blanket was folded over what looked like an improvised mattress. Beside it, some empty food cans and a water bottle still half full. "Guys," said Nathan with a trembling voice, "someone is living here. These things are new." Emily Grace's stomach turned. The possibility that someone was using that place as a dwelling frightened her, and at the same time sparked a curiosity she couldn't control. Who could this person be? Why were they hiding there? Lily Rose found more photographs scattered near a wall and gathered them carefully. They were images from the same era as the first ones, but these showed the whole family: the young grandma, an older man who must have been the grandfather they never knew, and 3 children who seemed to be around their age. "Look, Emily Grace," said the girl, showing a photo where the face of the man from the wallet could be clearly seen. "He was in our family." Emily Grace took the photograph and studied it intently. There was something familiar about that face, as if she had seen those eyes somewhere before. Suddenly she remembered a rainy afternoon when she was helping Grandma tidy the old closet in the bedroom. Margaret had found a box of photographs and, for a brief moment, had held an image in her hands, before quickly putting it away again. "Grandma cried that day," murmured Emily Grace, more to herself. "What?" asked Nathan, who was examining some notes scribbled on pieces of paper. "Once I saw Grandma crying while looking at a photo. She put it away quickly when she saw me, but I was sure there was someone in the photo that made her sad." The 3 fell silent for a few moments, processing the discovery. The air inside the cave felt heavy with unrevealed secrets, and the golden light filtering through the cracks began to fade as the sun set outside. "We have to go back," said Emily Grace finally. "The adults will notice we're gone." "But what about these things?" asked Lily Rose, still holding the photographs. "Are we going to tell Grandma?" Emily Grace didn't know how to answer. Part of her wanted to run home and show everything to her grandmother, but something in the back of her mind said there was more to the story than met the eye. The expression on the young grandmother's face in the photo, the state of the objects in the cave, the feeling that someone had been there recently, all of it created an atmosphere of mystery that made her hesitate. "Let's keep it a secret for now," she decided, "just until we understand better what's happening." Nathan didn't like the decision, but he trusted his older sister's judgment. Lily Rose simply nodded, still fascinated by the old photographs that showed her family in a way she had never imagined. Carefully, they put all the objects back more or less in the same positions they had found them, trying not to leave traces of their presence. Emily Grace took only one of the photographs, the one showing her young grandmother next to the man from the wallet, and hid it in her dress pocket. They left the cave one by one, with Butterscotch and Popcorn following reluctantly. The dogs seemed to want to stay in the cave, sniffing even more objects the children hadn't noticed, but they obeyed when Nathan called. When they got back to the yard, the discussion in the kitchen had stopped. Grandma Margaret was sitting on the porch, looking at the horizon with a tired, melancholy expression. Her grey hair was tied in a loose bun, and her hands, marked by work on the land, rested in her lap. "Where were you?" she asked without turning, as if she instinctively knew they had left the property. "Just playing in the backyard, Grandma," answered Emily Grace, feeling guilty for lying but knowing she needed more time to understand what they had discovered. Margaret finally turned to look at her grandchildren. Her brown eyes, which always conveyed affection and wisdom, seemed filled with a sadness Emily Grace had never noticed before. "Your parents went to town to take care of some business," said the grandmother in a tired voice. "They'll be staying there all night. It's just you and me today." Lily Rose ran to her grandmother's lap, as she always did when she sensed the adults were worried. Margaret hugged her tightly, kissing the top of the girl's head. "Grandma," said Lily Rose with the innocence typical of a 6-year-old, "do you have a brother?" Emily Grace felt her heart race. She hadn't expected her sister to ask such a direct question so soon. Margaret tensed for a moment, and Emily Grace could see her hands tighten slightly on the arms of the rocking chair. "Why do you want to know that, my dear?" asked the grandmother, trying to keep her voice normal. "Just curious," said Lily Rose. But Emily Grace noticed the girl was looking toward the rocks as she spoke. "I did have brothers," Margaret answered after a long pause. "But that was a long time ago. Some people get lost from us over the years." Nathan, always perceptive for his age, caught the tone of sadness in his grandmother's voice. "Lost how?" he asked. Margaret sighed deeply and looked again at the horizon, where the sun was almost setting behind the distant mountains. "Sometimes people make choices that take them away from family," she said slowly. "And sometimes it's just too hard to find the way back." Emily Grace felt the photograph burning in her dress pocket. There was much more to this story than Grandma was telling, and now she was certain the caveman was connected to the family's past in some painful way. That night, after Grandma put Lily Rose to sleep and Nathan retreated to the room he shared with his sisters, Emily Grace lay awake in bed, looking at the photograph in the moonlight coming through the window. The image showed Grandma at about 20 years old, radiant and happy, next to a man who was clearly younger than her. Both were smiling at the camera, but there was something in the man's eyes that suggested a restless, perhaps even troubled personality. On the back of the photograph, written in pencil in a feminine handwriting that Emily Grace recognized as Grandma's, were the words, "Me and Charles William, Midsummer Festival, 1975. Below, a phrase that made the girl's heart tighten, "My dear brother, even with all your flaws." Emily Grace carefully tucked the photograph between the pages of a schoolbook and finally managed to fall asleep. But her dreams were filled with images of dark tunnels and voices crying in the wind. The next morning, she woke to the barking of Butterscotch and Popcorn. The dogs were restless again, running around the yard and looking toward the rocks. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, but her movements seemed slower and more thoughtful than usual. "Good morning, Grandma," said Emily Grace, watching the elderly woman's expression closely. "Good morning, my dear. Did you sleep well?" asked Margaret, but her voice sounded distant. Emily Grace decided to risk a more direct question. "Grandma, yesterday you talked about people who get lost from the family. How does a person get lost like that?" Margaret stopped stirring the oatmeal and turned to look at her granddaughter. Her eyes were red, as if she had spent the night crying. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "people make mistakes that seem too big to be forgiven, and sometimes they become so ashamed that they'd rather disappear than have to face the consequences." "But if the person apologized," insisted Emily Grace, "if they came back and tried to make things right?" Margaret approached her granddaughter and placed one of her calloused hands on her face. "My dear, not all problems can be solved with just apologies. Sometimes so much time passes that the wounds grow too large to heal." At that moment, Nathan appeared in the kitchen, rubbing his sleepy eyes. "The dogs are barking again," he said. "It seems like they want to go to that place in the rocks." Emily Grace saw Grandma become alert immediately. "What place in the rocks?" asked Margaret with an urgency that did not go unnoticed. "Oh, it's just that they keep sniffing around there," replied Nathan, realizing he had said something he shouldn't have. Margaret looked from Nathan to Emily Grace with an expression that mixed worry and something that seemed like recognition. "You must not go near those rocks," she said firmly. "There are many loose stones and you could get hurt. And besides—" She hesitated, as if she were going to say something more but changed her mind. "And besides what, Grandma?" asked Emily Grace. "And besides, it's a place where no good people can hide," Margaret finished, but her voice trembled slightly. Lily Rose appeared in the kitchen at that moment, still in her pajamas with messy hair. "Good morning, family," she said cheerfully, but stopped upon sensing the tension in the air. Why does everyone look so serious?" "It's nothing, my dear," said Margaret, going back to stirring the oatmeal. "Let's have breakfast, and then you can help me pick the tangerines." During breakfast, Emily Grace carefully observed every reaction from her grandmother. When Butterscotch barked louder outside, Margaret startled and spilled a little coffee into the saucer. When Nathan casually mentioned that he loved exploring new places, his grandmother's eyes filled with tears that she tried to hide by wiping her face with her apron. Something was definitely very wrong, and Emily Grace was becoming more and more convinced that the discovery in the cave was the key to understanding her grandmother's suffering. After coffee, while Mrs. Margaret went to the backyard to tend to the chickens, the three children gathered in the bedroom. "Grandma is hiding something," said Emily Grace bluntly. "I noticed it too," agreed Nathan. "She got all weird when I talked about the rocks." Lily Rose, who had saved 2 slices of cake in a towel, looked at her siblings with concern. "Do you think we did something wrong yesterday?" she asked. "No," replied Emily Grace. "I think we discovered something that could help Grandma. I just don't know how yet." "Did you bring the photo?" asked Nathan. Emily Grace took the photograph from inside the book and showed it to her siblings again. In the daylight, the details were clearer. The man next to their young grandmother had a kind expression, but there was something about his smile that suggested a person who didn't take himself too seriously. "He seems nice," commented Lily Rose. "He does," agreed Emily Grace, "but Grandma got sad when she talked about lost siblings. Something happened between them." "Do you think he's still around?" asked Nathan. "I mean that he might be using the cave to hide." The question made the three of them fall silent. The possibility that the man in the photograph was still alive and living in hiding so close to the house was both frightening and fascinating. "There's only one way to find out," said Emily Grace finally. "Go back there?" asked Lily Rose with wide eyes. "Go back there. But this time we'll pay more attention to everything. If someone is living in the cave, they would have left more clues." Nathan nodded energetically, always ready for an adventure. Lily Rose hesitated for a moment, but curiosity overcame fear. "When?" she asked. "Now. Grandma is busy with the chickens, and it'll take her at least an hour to finish." The three slipped out quietly through the back door, taking the dogs, who immediately ran toward the rocks, as if they knew exactly where they were going. This time, Emily Grace had brought a small flashlight she found in the kitchen drawer. The tunnel entrance seemed less intimidating in the daylight, but it still carried that air of mystery and hidden secrets. They entered the cave more confidently than the first time, and soon were back in the main chamber. In the flashlight's beam, they could examine everything in much more detail. "Look at this," said Nathan, pointing to a pile of food cans they hadn't noticed the day before. "They're tuna, and the expiration date is from this year." Lily Rose found some clothes hanging on a branch that had been carefully placed between 2 rocks to serve as an improvised clothes rack. The clothes were old and patched, but clean. "Someone definitely lives here," confirmed Emily Grace, "and comes here often." It was then that Butterscotch began sniffing intensely at a corner of the cave where several smaller stones had been stacked as if to form a low wall. Behind them, they found a collection of objects that made the children's hearts beat faster. There was a diary with pages yellowed by time, some letters tied with a string, and a small metal box that rattled when shaken. But what caught their attention the most was a small photo album, much better preserved than the scattered photos they had found the day before. Emily Grace carefully opened the album and found dozens of family pictures. There were pictures of herself, Nathan and Lily Rose at various ages, photographs of their parents when they were still young, and many photos of their grandma Margaret over the years. "How did he get these photos?" murmured Nathan, looking at a picture of himself from 2 years earlier, playing in the same backyard where he was now. "He's been watching us," said Emily Grace with a trembling voice, "for years." Lily Rose opened the small metal box and found some old coins, a pocket watch that had stopped long ago, and a very thin gold chain with a heart-shaped pendant. Inside the heart was a tiny photo of a young woman who was clearly Grandma Margaret. "He never forgot her," said Lily Rose with the wisdom that sometimes comes from the youngest children. Emily Grace picked up the journal and opened it to the most recent pages. The handwriting was shaky and hard to read, but she managed to decipher some phrases. "Margaret is still beautiful, even after all this time. I see her in the yard tending to the flowers our mother planted. Her grandchildren have grown so much. The oldest one has the same drive to lead that Margaret had as a child. Today she cried in the yard. Does she still think of me? Would she forgive me after all I've done? The town doctor said my time is running out. I don't know if I have the courage to show myself before I go." The last words made Emily Grace swallow hard. There was an urgency to this situation that she hadn't understood before. "Guys," she said with a choked voice, "he's sick, and he wants to see Grandma before he can't anymore." Nathan and Lily Rose moved closer to read the journal over their sister's shoulder. The entries were sparse, but they painted the picture of a man who had been living on the outskirts of the property for years, watching the family from afar, consumed by guilt and regret. "What do you think he did that was so bad?" asked Lily Rose. Emily Grace continued flipping through the journal looking for more clues. A few pages back, she found a longer entry. "It's been 15 years since I ran away from here like a coward. Margaret trusted me with the money from her daddy's inheritance to invest in Sebastian's cattle ranch. I was sure it would work, that we could double the money. Instead, I lost everything. Every penny our parents left for us, all the future that Margaret had planned for the family. When I came back to tell her what had happened, she was waiting for me on the porch with that smile she always had when I arrived. I couldn't break her heart. I left a note and fled in the dead of night like a thief. Now I know I should have stayed. I should have faced her disappointment and tried to make things right, but I was young and foolish, and I thought it would be easier to disappear." The children fell silent, absorbing the information. The terrible crime that had separated their uncle from the family was nothing more than a financial mistake made with good intentions. "He lost money," said Nathan, summing up the situation. "And he was so ashamed that he ran away. And Grandma must have been left wondering what happened to him all these years," added Emily Grace. Lily Rose picked up the photo album again and pointed to one of the more recent pictures of Grandma Margaret. "Look how sad she looks in this photo," she said. "She misses him." Emily Grace felt a wave of emotion that almost made her cry. Here was the answer to the sorrow she had noticed in her grandma's eyes, but also a situation far more complex than an 11-year-old should have to handle alone. "What do we do now?" asked Nathan. Before Emily Grace could answer, they heard footsteps outside the cave. The three looked at each other in panic, quickly putting the journal and the album back where they found them. The footsteps were approaching slowly, as if the person was trying to be quiet. Butterscotch and Popcorn, who had been quietly exploring the cave until then, began to whimper softly. Emily Grace gestured for her siblings to stay quiet and hide behind the larger rocks. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure anyone could hear it. The shadow of a person appeared at the tunnel entrance, blocking part of the light coming from outside. It was someone tall, but stooped, who moved with difficulty. The person hesitated at the entrance for a long moment before starting to move into the cave. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot, as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. When the figure emerged into the main chamber, the children could see him clearly. He was a man of about 60, too thin, with an unkempt greyish beard and clothes that had once been good, but were now worn by time and a hard life. His eyes were exactly like those in the photograph, kind but filled with sadness. The man stopped when he saw the dogs and smiled slightly. "Hello, little friends," he said in a hoarse voice. "Have you come back to visit me?" It was then he noticed that some things were out of place. His photo album wasn't exactly where he had left it, and there were small footprints in the dirt that definitely weren't his. "Is someone here?" he asked, looking around the cave. Emily Grace felt there was no way to hide any longer. Slowly she stood up from behind the rocks, followed by her siblings. The man stood motionless when he saw them, as if seeing ghosts. "You are," he began to say, but his voice failed. "We are Mrs. Margaret's grandchildren," said Emily Grace with more courage than she actually felt. "And you are Charles William. It wasn't a question. It was a statement based on hours of investigation and the certainty that only children have when they discover an important truth. The man leaned against the cave wall as if his legs could no longer support the weight of his body. "How did you—" He tried to speak again. "We found your things," explained Nathan, pointing to the wallet and photographs. "And we read some parts of your journal." Charles William closed his eyes and sighed deeply. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally. "It's dangerous. And Margaret, she can't know you found me." "Why not?" asked Lily Rose with the typical frankness of a child. "Grandma cries when she thinks of you." "How do you know that?" asked Charles William, surprised. "Because we pay attention," replied Emily Grace. "And we know when someone we love is hurting." Charles William looked at the three children for a long moment. In them was the same determination he had always admired in his sister Margaret, the same ability to see beyond appearances and get to the heart of problems. "Sit down," he said finally, pointing to some rocks that served as makeshift benches. "If you already know so much, you deserve to know the rest of the story." The children settled in a semicircle in front of Charles William, who sat on the old mattress that served as a bed. Butterscotch and popcorn approached him, and he petted them absently while gathering his thoughts. "You know I lost the family's money," he began, "but you don't know how much that destroyed your grandmother's dreams." Charles William told how Margaret had planned to use their parents' inheritance to buy more land, expand the cattle ranch, and secure a prosperous future for the family's future generations. How she had worked hard for years to save every extra penny, and how she had completely trusted her younger brother's judgment. "When I lost everything," he continued, "it wasn't just the money that was gone. It was all her plans, all the security she had built. And worse, it was the trust she had in me." "But why didn't you stay to help fix things?" asked Emily Grace. "Because I was a coward," admitted Charles William, "and because I was certain she would never forgive me. I thought it would be easier for her to forget me than to have to deal with the disappointment of seeing me every day." Nathan, ever practical, asked the question on everyone's mind. "And why did you come back?" Charles William smiled sadly. "I never really left," he confessed. "I stayed around here all these years, worked on distant farms, did odd jobs in town, but I always came back here. I couldn't stay completely away." He explained how he had discovered the cave a few years after running away from home when he returned to the region during a severe drought, how he had started using it only as a temporary shelter, but ended up turning the place into a permanent home as the years passed. "I watched you grow up," he said, looking especially at Lily Rose. "I saw Margaret teaching you the same things our mother taught us. I saw her being the strong matriarch I always knew she would be." "She doesn't seem strong," said Lily Rose. "She seems sad." The girl's words hit Charles William like a punch to the stomach. He had spent so much time imagining his sister was better off without him that he had never considered that maybe she had also been suffering from the separation. "Mr. Charles William," said Emily Grace, using the respectful tone her grandma had taught her for addressing elders, "are you sick?" The direct question caught him off guard. "How do you know that?" "We read your journal," admitted Nathan, "about the doctor and about time running out." Charles William was quiet for a moment, deciding how much of the truth he could share with children so young. "My heart isn't very good," he said finally, "and I don't have the money for the treatment I need." "Grandma has money," said Lily Rose immediately. "She always says money is meant to help family." "But I'm not her family anymore," replied Charles William sadly. "Not after what I did." "Of course you are," exclaimed Emily Grace. "Family doesn't stop being family because of a mistake. If that was so, my parents would have given me away to someone else a long time ago." The child's simple logic made Charles William smile for the first time since he had entered the cave. "You are very special children," he said. "Margaret did a good job raising you." "So why don't you go talk to her?" insisted Nathan. "Why do you keep hiding?" Charles William stood up and walked to the wall where he had hung the oldest family photographs. "Because sometimes time makes things impossible to fix," he said. "It's been so long that maybe it's better to leave things as they are." "That's nonsense," said Lily Rose with the frankness only a 6-year-old can have. Grandma always says it's never too late for a real apology. Emily Grace stood up and approached Charles William. "Mr. Charles William," she said, "if you die here alone, Grandma will never know what happened to you. She'll spend the rest of her life wondering. Is that fair to her?" The question was like a slap of reality. Charles William had spent so much time focused on his own shame and guilt that he had never fully considered the impact of his disappearance on his sister's life. "She must hate me," he murmured. "People we hate don't make us cry," said Nathan with wisdom beyond his years. "They make us angry. Grandma doesn't get angry when she thinks of you. She gets sad." Charles William sat back down, clearly shaken by the conversation. The children could see he was wrestling internally, weighing the fear of confrontation against the desire for reconciliation. "You don't understand," he finally said. "I have nothing to offer her, no way to make up for what I did. I have no money, no health. I have nothing but late apologies." "You have love," said Lily Rose simply, "and you have the memories from when you were children, and you have the years you spent watching our family, taking care of us from afar. That counts for something." Emily Grace had an idea. "Mr. Charles William," she said, "if we told Grandma we found you, what would happen?" "She'd probably be furious with me for being so close to you without her knowing," he replied, "and she'd be worried about your safety." "What if we told her you were sick and needed help?" Charles William hesitated. "Margaret was always too generous for her own good," he said. "She'd probably try to help me even if it was bad for her." "Then why would that be bad?" asked Nathan. "Because I don't deserve her generosity after all I've done." Emily Grace felt a wave of frustration. It was clear to her that the uncle and the grandmother loved each other and wanted to reconcile, but pride and guilt were preventing it from happening. "Mr. Charles William," she said with determination, "you're going to have to trust us, because we're going to tell Grandma we found you whether you want us to or not." Charles William was alarmed. "No, you can't do that. Margaret might—" "Might what?" interrupted Emily Grace. "Might finally stop crying when she looks at the old photos. Might finally understand what happened to the brother she loved. Might have a chance to forgive and be forgiven." "Forgiven?" asked Charles William, confused. "Of course," said Lily Rose. "Grandma also needs to be forgiven for letting you go without fighting to make you stay." The youngest child's observation revealed a perspective none of them had considered before. Perhaps Margaret also carried guilt and regret. Perhaps she also wondered if she could have done something different that night 15 years ago. Charles William looked at the three children who had invaded his hiding place and, in a matter of minutes, dismantled all the justifications he had built over the years to avoid facing his sister. "You're small, but you're very persuasive," he said with a sad smile. "You remind me a lot of Margaret when she was a child and decided she wanted something." "So you'll talk to her?" asked Emily Grace. Charles William was silent for a long time, looking at the photographs on the wall, then at the diary where he had recorded years of longing and regret, and finally at the three children looking at him expectantly. "I don't know if I have the courage," he finally admitted. "Then we'll go with you," said Nathan, "to give you courage." "No," said Charles William quickly. "If I do this, I have to do it alone. You've already done too much by finding me." Emily Grace stood up again, this time walking over to Charles William's photo album. She opened it to the page showing Grandma Margaret in the backyard, tending to the flowers. "This photo was taken last week," she said. "You were there, watching. Why didn't you get closer?" "Because I didn't know what to say." "Then start with, 'Hi, Margaret. I missed you.'" The simplicity of the suggestion made Charles William laugh, despite the tension of the moment. "You think it's that simple?" "Love is simple," said Lily Rose. "Complicated are the excuses we make up not to love." Charles William looked at the 6-year-old who had just uttered one of the wisest sentences he had ever heard. In her naturalness was a truth he had lost over the years of isolation and self-punishment. "All right," he finally said. "I'll think about what you said." "No," said Emily Grace firmly. "Thinking won't solve anything. You've been thinking for 15 years. Now you have to act." "Today?" asked Charles William, alarmed. "Today," confirmed the three children in unison. "But I need to prepare, decide what I'm going to say." "Mr. Charles William," interrupted Nathan. "If you keep preparing, you'll never be ready. You have to go now while you have the courage." Charles William knew the children were right. If he left there without acting, he'd probably spend a few more days or weeks or months convincing himself he wasn't ready, and time, as the town doctor had noted, was running out. "How are we going to do this?" he asked. "We'll go first," explained Emily Grace. "We'll prepare Grandma, tell her we found someone who needs help. Then you show up. And if she gets angry, then at least she'll know the truth," said Lily Rose, "and the truth is always better than doubt." Charles William took one last look around the cave that had been his home for so long. He saw years of loneliness, of regret, of missed opportunities, but now he also saw the possibility of a different ending to his story. "All right," he said, "let's do it." The children smiled simultaneously, and Charles William realized that, for the first time in 15 years, he truly felt hope. They left the cave together, with butterscotch and popcorn running ahead, as if they knew something important was about to happen. The afternoon sun painted the yard with golden hues, and the family's stone house seemed more welcoming than Charles William remembered. "You'll stay here behind the rocks," instructed Emily Grace. "When we wave, you come." "And if she tells me to leave?" asked Charles William, the fear showing in his voice. "Then we insist," said Nathan, "just like we insisted with you." Lily Rose took Charles William's hand for a moment. "Everything will be fine," she said, with the absolute confidence only children have. "Sometimes grown-ups forget that loving each other is the easiest thing in the world." With those words, the three children ran toward the house, leaving Charles William hidden behind the larger rocks, his heart beating so hard he was sure it could be heard for miles. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing lunch when the three children burst through the door, clearly agitated. "Grandma," called Emily Grace, "you need to come see something urgent." "What happened?" asked Margaret, immediately concerned. "Are you all right?" "We're fine," said Nathan, "but we found someone who needs help." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and looked at her grandchildren carefully. There was something in their behavior that suggested this was very serious. "What kind of help?" she asked. "A person who's been living in the rocks," explained Lily Rose, "and they're sick." Margaret felt a chill in her stomach. Her motherly intuition had been telling her for weeks that something was different at the back of the property. The dogs had been acting strange, and sometimes she had the feeling of being watched. "Did you talk to this person?" she asked, trying to stay calm. "We did," confirmed Emily Grace. "And they're a good person, they're just going through a hard time." "Children," said Margaret seriously, "you know you shouldn't talk to strangers, especially not people living in hiding." "But Grandma," insisted Nathan, "they need medical help and they have nowhere to go." Margaret looked out the window toward the rocks. Part of her wanted to protect her grandchildren from any potentially dangerous situation, but another part, the part raised with solid Christian values, knew she couldn't ignore someone in need. "Where is this person now?" she asked. "Waiting outside," said Emily Grace, "to see if you'll agree to help." Margaret took a deep breath. There was something in her grandchildren's behavior that told her she wasn't getting the whole truth, but she also sensed they were genuinely worried about someone. "All right," she said finally. "Let's see what this is about. But you stay behind me. Understood?" The three children nodded vigorously and ran to the door. Margaret followed them, straightening her apron and mentally preparing to deal with whatever situation she might encounter. When they stepped into the yard, Emily Grace discreetly gestured toward the rocks. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Margaret began to wonder if the children hadn't imagined the whole thing. That's when a figure slowly emerged from behind the largest stones. It was a thin man with a graying beard, walking with difficulty. He stopped at a safe distance, clearly nervous, and looked directly at Margaret. The world stopped for both of them. 15 years vanished in an instant. Margaret saw not the worn man before her, but the boy she had helped raise, the brother she had protected when he was little, the young man she had trusted to care for the family's future. "Charles William," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "Hi, Margaret," he replied, his voice choked. "I missed you." The children watched the scene in silence, realizing they were witnessing something far greater than they had imagined. Love, pain, regret, and forgiveness seemed to hang in the air between the two siblings who had spent 15 years separated by pride and misunderstandings. Margaret took a step forward, then another, until she was just a few meters from her brother. She could see then how much weight he had lost, the wrinkles that marked his face, the eyes that held the same kindness as always, but now carried years of suffering. "Have you been here all this time?" she asked. "Nearby," confirmed Charles William. "I could never bring myself to go too far away." "Why didn't you come home?" Charles William looked down, unable to meet his sister's gaze. "Because I was ashamed of what I did. Because I didn't know how to ask for forgiveness for destroying everything you had planned." Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. She had imagined this moment so many times over the years, but never like this, in the middle of the yard, with her grandchildren watching, after discovering her brother had lived like a hermit just a few miles from home. "You didn't destroy anything," she said finally. "We lost money. Money can be recovered. What can't be recovered is the lost time." Charles William looked up, surprised by his sister's reaction. "But the plans, the farm, everything you wanted to do." "Everything I wanted to do was to make sure our family stayed together and prospered," Margaret interrupted. "And the family didn't prosper because you were missing." The words hit Charles William like a bolt of lightning. All those years he had imagined he was making his sister's life easier by staying away, that she was better off not having to deal with the disappointment of his failure. "Margaret, you abandoned me," she said, but without anger. "When I needed you most, when we had to decide together how to overcome the problem, you ran away. That hurt much more than losing the money." Charles William felt his legs weaken. He leaned against a nearby rock, clearly shaken. "I thought it would be easier for you to forget me." "Charles William," said Margaret, moving even closer, "you are my brother. I can't forget you. I spent all these years wondering if you were alive, if you were okay, if you needed help." Emily Grace, watching the conversation, realized the moment had come to reveal the whole truth. "Grandma," she said, stepping forward, "Uncle Charles William is sick. He needs surgery, but he doesn't have the money to pay for it." Margaret turned to her granddaughter, then looked back at her brother. "Is it true?" she asked. Charles William nodded sadly. "Heart problems," he confirmed. "But I didn't come here to ask for financial help, Margaret. I came because these angels here," he said, gesturing to the children, "made me understand that I couldn't die without at least trying to apologize to you." The word "die" made Margaret startle. "That's serious?" "If I don't have surgery in the next few weeks—" Charles William didn't need to finish the sentence. Margaret understood the gravity of the situation, and in that moment, all the resentment she had carried for 15 years simply evaporated. "Let's go inside," she said firmly. "We'll talk properly, and then we'll see what needs to be done." Charles William hesitated. "Margaret, I don't know if—" "You are my brother," she said, extending her hand to him, "and this is your home. It always has been." When Charles William took his sister's hand, they both felt 15 years of loneliness and regret begin to dissolve. The children smiled, knowing they had done the right thing. They walked together toward the house, Margaret supporting her brother, who was clearly weaker than he tried to show. On the porch, she stopped and looked at her grandchildren. "You knew who he was from the start, didn't you?" she asked. Emily Grace nodded. "We found his pictures in the cave, and we saw how sad you get when you look at the old family photos." "You are very special children," said Margaret, hugging all three at once. "And very brave." "We just wanted everyone to stop being sad," said Lily Rose. Margaret looked at her brother, who was watching the scene with tears in his eyes. "Welcome back, Charles William," she said. "We have a lot of lost time to make up for." That afternoon, sitting in the kitchen where they had grown up together, the two siblings talked as they hadn't in decades. Charles William told of the years of loneliness, the jobs he took to survive, how he watched the family from afar. Margaret told of the nights she cried without knowing why, the times she thought she saw someone familiar in town, how she had never completely stopped looking for him. The children played in the yard, but every now and then they would run to the kitchen to make sure the adults weren't fighting. They always found the two talking, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, but always together. When night fell, Margaret had made all the necessary decisions. Charles William would stay at the house until he fully recovered from the surgery. She would pay all the medical costs, and then they would see together how he could contribute to the family again. "I still have nothing to offer," protested Charles William. "You have yourself," replied Margaret, "and that has always been more valuable than money." That night, for the first time in 15 years, Charles William slept in a real bed, between walls he had known since childhood, listening to the familiar sounds of the house that had never truly stopped being his home. The children, exhausted by the day's emotional adventure, fell asleep quickly. But before drifting off, Emily Grace looked out the window toward the rocks, where it had all begun. The cave was still there, but now it was no longer a hiding place of shame and loneliness. It was simply a reminder of how love can overcome any distance, any misunderstanding, any wound that time and pride can create. The next day, when the children's parents returned from town, they found a scene they didn't expect. Margaret and a man they didn't immediately recognize talking animatedly on the porch, while the children played in the yard with a joy they hadn't shown for weeks. "Who is that man?" asked the children's mother. "That's Uncle Charles William," replied Lily Rose, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "He was lost, but we found him." There were explanations, of course, tears, surprise, and a long process of understanding how 15 years of separation had ended, thanks to the curiosity of 3 children and the courage to face painful truths. Nathan's surgery was scheduled for the following week. Margaret insisted on accompanying him personally, and the children made cards wishing him good luck. The doctor was impressed by the improvement in the patient's emotional state, who had clearly found reasons to fight for life. During the recovery, Nathan told childhood stories that Margaret had forgotten, made the grandchildren laugh with his adventures from the years he was absent, and slowly began to rebuild the bonds he thought were lost forever. The house, which once held an inexplicable melancholy, was filled with life again. Meals grew longer because there was so much to talk about. The backyard echoed with more laughter because there were more stories to tell. And at night, when the children were already asleep, the 2 siblings would stay on the porch talking about plans for the future. Nathan, with his health restored, took over part of the management of the farm. His experience on different farms in the region had given him valuable knowledge about new cultivation and livestock techniques. Within a few months, the property was more prosperous than it had been in years, but more important than financial prosperity was emotional prosperity. Margaret started singing again while cooking. The children gained an uncle who taught them about plants and animals, with the patience of someone who had learned to value every moment. And Nathan discovered that forgiveness was even sweeter than he had imagined. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we are just starting out. Now, continuing. 6 months after the reconciliation, the family decided to transform the old cave into something special. With the help of Nathan and the children, Margaret created a small family memorial there. Old photographs were framed and placed on the stone walls, alongside new portraits showing the family reunited. In the center of the cave, they placed a rustic table and some chairs. It was the perfect place for picnics on rainy days, for intimate conversations, and for remembering how an unexpected discovery had changed everyone's lives. A small plaque at the cave entrance bore the phrase suggested by the children, "Place where we found what was lost." But the true transformation had happened in their hearts. Margaret learned that holding on to resentment was an unnecessary burden. Nathan learned that unconditional love doesn't need to be earned, only accepted. And the children learned that sometimes adults need the help of the young to remember life's most important things. The story spread through the small rural community, becoming a local legend about the power of forgiveness and the persistence of family love. Neighbors who had drifted apart over minor disagreements reconciled. Parents who hadn't spoken to their children for years reconnected. Emily Grace, Nathan, and Lily Rose became minor celebrities at school, known as the children who found the lost uncle. But for them, the true reward wasn't fame, but seeing the happiness in their grandma's eyes and knowing they had been instruments of a reconciliation that was meant to happen. One Sunday afternoon, exactly 1 year after the discovery in the cave, the whole family was gathered for a special lunch. Nathan had fully recovered from the surgery and was now helping Margaret care for a new herd of goats that was yielding excellent results. The children were playing in the backyard with Butterscotch and Popcorn, who had become true family heroes for guiding the children to the discovery that changed everything. "You know," said Margaret to her brother as they watched their grandchildren play, "I think our parents would be proud to see the family united again." "I'm sure they would," agreed Charles William, "and they would be especially proud of these three little detectives who didn't give up investigating until they uncovered the truth." Emily Grace, who had overheard the conversation, ran over to the two adults. "Uncle Charles William," she said, "can I ask a question?" "Of course, my dear." "Are you happy to have come back home?" Charles William looked around, seeing the house where he had grown up, the sister he had lost and found again, the grand-nephews and nieces who had accepted him without question, and felt a peace he hadn't experienced in decades. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," he answered sincerely. "And you, Grandma?" asked Nathan, joining the conversation. "Are you happy to have your brother back?" Margaret hugged both grandchildren and smiled at her brother. "You know," she said, "all these years I felt like something was missing in my life, but I didn't know exactly what. Now I know it was this. It was having my family complete again." Lily Rose, not wanting to be left out of the conversation, ran to them and nestled in Margaret's lap. "And us?" she asked. "Were we good children for helping you find each other?" "You were more than good children," said Charles William. "You were angels, brave angels who weren't afraid to meddle with adult secrets to fix a situation that the adults themselves couldn't resolve." The three children smiled with pride. They had learned a valuable lesson about not accepting sadness as something inevitable, about questioning when things didn't seem right, and about having the courage to act when they knew something needed to be done. That night, as the whole family was gathered in the living room telling stories and planning the future, a storm brewed outside. The strong wind made the windows rattle, and the rain drummed on the old shingled roof. "Imagine if we were still fighting on a night like this," said Margaret, looking worriedly out the window. "Charles William would be alone in the cave, sick and with no one to care for him." "But we're not fighting," said Charles William, "and I'm not alone. I'm home with my family, where I should have always been." Emily Grace, who was arranging her dolls in a corner of the room, stopped to look at the two siblings. "Do you know what I learned from all this?" she said. "What, my child?" asked Margaret. "That sometimes people get so afraid of being rejected that they end up rejecting themselves first, and that sometimes you have to be brave enough to risk getting hurt if you want a chance to be loved." The 11-year-old's words carried a wisdom that impressed all the adults present. Charles William stood up and went to Emily Grace, kneeling to be at her eye level. "You're right," he said, "and thank you for being brave enough to help me face my fears." "It was easy," replied Emily Grace, "because I knew you two loved each other. You just needed to remember that." Nathan, who was flipping through a storybook, looked up. "Uncle Charles William," he said, "now that you're well and living here, will you teach us more things about the rocks and the caves?" "Of course," answered Charles William, "but this time we'll explore together, with no secrets, and we'll teach other children too about how nature can teach us important things about life." Lily Rose, who had been quiet for a few minutes, suddenly perked up. "Can we make the cave a place for other families who are fighting to meet and talk?" The youngest child's idea made everyone laugh, but there was something genuinely beautiful in the suggestion. "You know," said Margaret, "maybe it's not a bad idea. We could create a space where people could come to resolve family problems, to talk about difficult things. A place of healing," added Charles William, "a place where people could set pride aside and focus on what really matters." And that's how the project that would become known in the region as the Cave of Reconciliation was born. Families from all over the area began seeking out Margaret and Charles William when they were facing problems that seemed impossible to solve. The cave's unique environment, with its golden natural lighting and walls that echoed as if holding ancient secrets, created an atmosphere that encouraged honesty and forgiveness. The children often helped, with their natural ability to see beyond the complications adults created. Emily Grace became especially skilled at asking the right questions. Nathan developed a talent for finding common ground between people who thought they had nothing that united them. Lily Rose had the gift of saying exactly the right thing at the right time, even without fully understanding the complexity of the situations. Margaret's house transformed into a place of pilgrimage for people who had lost hope of reconciliation. It wasn't formal therapy. None of them had training for that. But it was perhaps something more powerful. It was living proof that love can overcome any obstacle when people are willing to open their hearts. 2 years after the original discovery, the small town where they lived organized a festival in honor of the family. The mayor gave a speech about how the story of Margaret and Charles William had inspired a wave of reconciliations that was strengthening the entire community. But the most moving moment of the festival was when Emily Grace, now 13 and even more determined, climbed onto the small stage set up in the main square. "I wanted to say something to everyone," she began, her voice clear and firm. "When I was little—" "You still are little," someone in the audience shouted, causing laughter. "When I was younger," corrected Emily Grace, smiling, "I thought adults always knew what to do. But I discovered that sometimes adults forget important things that children know naturally." She paused for a moment, looking at her grandma and uncle in the front row. "Children know that loving is more important than being right. They know that apologizing is more important than saving face. And they know that family is family, no matter what happens." The audience fell silent, absorbing the teenager's words. "So, I want to ask one thing of all the adults here," Emily Grace continued. "If you're fighting with someone in your family, if you haven't spoken to a sibling or a child or a parent for years, don't wait any longer. Life is too short to hold grudges, and love is too strong to be wasted on pride." When she stepped down from the stage, there were tears in many eyes, and in the days that followed, the small town saw a series of reconciliations that confirmed the power of simple words spoken with an open heart. Charles William, watching all this, often wondered what would have happened if he hadn't had the courage to accept the help of those 3 brave children. He probably would have died alone in the cave, taking with him the opportunity for reconciliation he had waited 15 years for. Margaret, in turn, learned not to keep unnecessary secrets. She began telling her grandchildren stories about the family, about the mistakes and successes of past generations, so that future generations could learn from the experiences of their elders. The 3 children grew up maintaining a special connection with each other and with the cave that had been the setting of their greatest adventure. Emily Grace became a lawyer, specializing in family mediation. Nathan became a veterinarian, always caring for animals that, like butterscotch and popcorn, had the instinct to bring people together. Lily Rose graduated in psychology, dedicating her career to helping families communicate better. But regardless of where life took them, the 3 always returned to the cave on special dates, to remember the day they discovered that true love is stronger than any wound, more persistent than any grudge, and more lasting than any misunderstanding. The cave continued to be a place of reconciliation for many years. Hundreds of families passed through there, leaving their quarrels at the entrance and emerging with renewed hearts. The stone walls seemed to have absorbed so many tears of joy and relief that the very air of the place carried a healing energy. Charles William lived another 15 years after his surgery, long enough to see his great-nephews and nieces marry and have their own children. When he finally passed, it was in peace, surrounded by the family he had reunited thanks to the courage of 3 children who refused to accept that some wounds cannot be healed. Margaret followed him a few years later, but not before seeing the family tradition of unity and forgiveness passed on to a new generation. In her will, she officially designated the cave as a community space for reconciliation, ensuring that the story that began with a childhood discovery would continue helping families for generations to come. On the main wall of the cave, a bronze plaque told the summarized story of what had happened there. But the most important phrase, engraved in golden letters, were the words Lily Rose had spoken on that first day. "Sometimes grown-ups forget that loving each other is the easiest thing in the world, and that is how 3 curious children, 2 scent hounds, and a cave hidden in the rocks became responsible for one of the most beautiful lessons about forgiveness and family love that a small town in the heart of Appalachia had ever witnessed." The story spread beyond the town's limits, being told in other regions, inspiring other families, creating a wave of reconciliations that never truly ended, because some discoveries are too big to be confined to the place where they happened. And to this day, when someone with family troubles visits the cave, they can feel the comforting presence of all those who found there the courage to forgive and the wisdom to love unconditionally. The golden rocks continue to reflect the sunlight, creating that magical lighting that made 3 children feel safe enough to explore the unknown. And every now and then, visitors report hearing echoes of children's laughter and joyful barks, as if butterscotch and popcorn were still running through the cave, guiding new discoveries and new reconciliations. Because true love never truly gets lost. Sometimes it just hides in dark caves, waiting for someone to be brave enough to light a lamp and show the way back home. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story and where you're listening from. Do you believe the children made the right decision by interfering in the adults' lives? Should all families have the courage to seek reconciliation like Mrs. Margaret and Mr. Charles William did? We would love to read your sincere opinion in the comments. Thank you for your company. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heart-touching stories.